The Anabaptists were convinced that for several hundred years Jesus had been marginalised. His life and teaching was too threatening for the Christendom Empire, and so had been marginalised. And they were convinced that this was wrong and that they needed to restore Jesus to the very centre of their faith and take very seriously his teachings. The Anabaptists agreed with the Reformers that we are saved by the grace of God, not by our human efforts, but they placed a much greater emphasis on discipleship. And because of that, the Reformers were convinced that they were going back to the old idea of salvation by works. The Anabaptists were convinced that the grace of God was not just to forgive past sins, but to empower them to live differently. And so they placed much more emphasis on the concept of new birth than simply forensic justification. The Anabaptists agreed with the Reformers that the Bible was authoritative, but they disagreed about how to interpret it. They were convinced that it should be interpreted by the community when the community was gathered together, that the emphasis should be on obedience rather than simply understanding, and that Jesus was the centre of the Bible and therefore the key to its interpretation. One of the distinctives of the early Anabaptists was the way that they held together church and mission. So, as well as agreeing with the Reformers about the priesthood of all believers, they taught and practiced that all believers were missionaries. And so the empowering of the whole congregation to be involved in mission, I believe, is something that we can take from the Anabaptists. Also, their emphasis on lifestyle, that it's not just through words, but it's through living out the gospel that we communicate the good news. The early Anabaptists insisted that the church must be free from state control and that it was entered voluntarily. It was not something you were born into, but something you were born again into. And so for them, believers' baptism was very significant as a way of indicating that this was a matter of serious discipleship rather than just institutional belonging. They were convinced also that the church was for participants, not spectators, and so the church should be multi-voiced in every way. I think one of the hard teachings of the Anabaptist tradition is that we need to be accountable to one another. They placed quite a bit of emphasis on what they called the rule of Christ in Matthew 18, which talks about a community that cares enough for each other to bring correction and admonition as well as encouragement. And in cultures that are highly individualistic, I think this is a very countercultural teaching, and we find it difficult to put this into practice. The Korean church is significantly larger and stronger than the church in the UK at the moment. I understand that there are some signs of decline, but at present you still have significant resources. And I would encourage you to make good use of the time that's available, good use of the resources you have, to reimagine and rethink what church might look like in a changing culture. That's something that we are working on in the UK, but our situation is somewhat more perilous than yours. So I would encourage you not to wait until you hit some of the same difficulties that we're now facing. I think because the Anabaptist tradition is fairly new in Korea, as it has been in Britain over the last 20 years or so, there is a need simply to explain what the Anabaptist tradition has to offer. I recognise that it's still seen here by many people as a heresy rather than a creative Christian tradition. So there needs to be quite a bit of work done simply to explain the nature of Anabaptism, the way in which it has been misrepresented, and to give people insight into what it offers to the church. So I think plenty of conversations, good networking between those who are interested, and the provision of good resources.